When you think 5th gen console gaming, most of you will think PlayStation and Nintendo 64. But if you're a retro gamer in 2023, many will think about the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was considered an abysmal failure a short time after its very unexpected launch in the West in 1995. Today, however, it is one of the most coveted consoles for a retro gamer and retro collectors. While you may find a swarm of PlayStation and Nintendo 64 consoles for the taking at any given time in almost any game store, the Sega Saturn consoles, however, are few and far between, forcing most people to seek the Sega Saturn out on online retailers such as eBay. Because of the limited amount of consoles available and the low interest in the 90s, it of course is now one of the most expensive consoles to own and game on. We see a similar situation with other consoles like the Atari Jaguar, TurboGrafx-16, 3DO, and Neo Geo. However, out of all these consoles, the one that deserves to be revisited the most is, of course, the Sega Saturn. Is the heavy price tag worth it? Is there any real support left for the system? Today, on this video, we will discuss why the Sega Saturn is still a must-buy for every retro gamer. Number 1. Emulation isn't really a good option. Over the years, emulation has improved drastically for systems such as the N64, PlayStation, and even consoles like the PC Engine. This has certainly not been the case for the Sega Saturn. While systems like the PS1 have almost a 100% conversion rate, which means almost 100% of ISOs will play on some type of emulator, the Sega Saturn, from my experience, something along the lines of around 60%. It's a rough estimate and anecdotal based on what I've experienced, but I have tried to play the Sega Saturn on multiple devices from the Nvidia Shield, RetroPie, and even PC. And while some do it well for certain games, it is all over the place in the performance from game to game. Number 2. The hacking community is alive and well. As we know, most of the great games that came to the Sega Saturn were released only in Japan. These included some of the best RPGs of the 5th gen. Games like Shining Force 3 and Vandal Hearts have been translated and patched to include English text in the game, and some have even had the entire games dubbed over. RPGs aren't the only ones. If you have been dying to play Symphony of the Night on the Sega Saturn, even this game has an English patch. And not only does it have an English patch, but it has had many of the bugs that had made it the weaker version of its PS1 version patched out of the game to play and run much better on the Sega Saturn. Number 3. The best arcade shmup console, shoot-'em-up console to date. While many tout the PC Engine as the shoot-'em-up king of the consoles, the Sega Saturn gives it a real run for its money. The West had a lacking library of shoot-'em-ups for the Sega Saturn, but boy did the Japanese arcade ports come out in full force. Games like Battle Garaga, Batsugun, Radiant Silvergun, and Dodonpachi made this console a 32-bit shoot-'em-up powerhouse. And there isn't just a few shmups. There are over 50 shoot-'em-up games for the Sega Saturn library, many of which are arcade ports that never got ported to the console in the West. For this reason alone, it is worth owning a Sega Saturn. Number 4. The Sega Saturn is not expensive to play games on. You must think I'm crazy, right? Notice I said it isn't expensive to game on, not it isn't expensive to collect for. Remember when I mentioned the hacking community? Well, the same hackers have created software that allows people to bypass the copyright system built into the Sega Saturn. This was a complicated system Sega created by detecting the wobble in the CD itself as this CD-ROM attempted to read copywritten areas of the disc. If the drive didn't pick up the characteristic wobble pattern and how data was written to the disc, it refused to authenticate the drive as valid. This copyright system works so well, it wasn't cracked until 2016. Now retro gamers can buy or make their own action replay cards with the Sega Saturn Kai software loaded onto it and simply insert it into the back of the cartridge slot on the Sega Saturn, allowing you to play any burned game. This is a great way to experience all the amazing Saturn games without the insane cost that goes along with it. Number 5, re-experience different ports. Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Need for Speed are all PlayStation games that had releases on the Sega Saturn. But one of the most iconic games to get a dual release was Castlevania Symphony of the Night, a game that was only ported to the least on the Sega Saturn. But if you are a fan of the series, this is a very good reason to own a Sega Saturn. The game is considerably different on the Sega Saturn. The version makes Maria a playable character, and it even has added levels that aren't even in the PlayStation version. Not only did the Saturn have ports of our favorite PS1 games, but in some cases, the Saturn version was the best. Rayman was a game that had ports to not only the Saturn, but also the Jaguar, and while all are great ports, the Saturn version has the richest detail and color palette due to the Saturn being built specifically to be a 2D powerhouse. Number 6. The Sega Saturn is a 2D powerhouse. The Sega Saturn was the first real successor to the Sega Genesis. The Sega team was finally all in on next gen. While the machine was capable of producing 3D rendered polygons, it focused heavily on 2D capabilities that the previous gen didn't do so well. At the time of development in 1993 and 94, its predecessor, the Sega Genesis, struggled with things such as sprite scaling. Where the Genesis lacked, the Saturn would thrive. Games like Astal, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Magic Knight Rayearth, and Albert Odyssey gave us 2D visuals never seen before. The 2D of the Saturn is a sight to be seen, and while as much as we love and sometimes hate the polygon error on the PlayStation and N64, the 2D experience on the Saturn can be a breath of fresh air to go back to on a generation of consoles that went through some real growing pains when it came to polygon gaming. Number 7. Sega's first-party games. The Sega development team gave us some of the best arcade-style games of the 90s, many of which got direct ports to the Sega Saturn. Sega Rally, Daytona USA, Virtual Fighter 2 gave us all the experience of the arcade in our home. Today, these are still some of the best games to own on the Saturn, and in my opinion, play best on the original hardware. Many of these games were great at showcasing the Saturn's capabilities. Sega Rally, for example, is one of the best racing games on the Saturn and was miles better than the PS1 launch title, Ridge Racer. Number 8. Massive library of games. Many consoles that failed did so with a very lackluster library. I mentioned a few at the beginning of this video. The Sega Saturn was considered mostly a failed system in the West, but had a huge library in Japan. Sega Saturn's library consisted of over 1,200 games when you combine the North American and Japanese libraries. My guess is you'd be hard-pressed to find a library that large on any other console sought after as much as the Sega Saturn. The amount of games to experience for the first time, this makes the console worth owning and revisiting. Number 9. A wide variety of gaming genres. A massive library of games also means there is a ton of variety of games for the Sega Saturn. When I was a kid and had a Sega Saturn, I was in it for the arcade type games the Saturn brought us. But if you're a fan of RPGs, then there's also a ton of games for you as well. This system seems to have it all, and still does, which is why if you're a retro gamer, then you'd be doing yourself a disservice of not re-exploring or exploring for the first time its library of games. Well guys, there you have it. My 9 reasons of why you need to own a Sega Saturn. If you are a retro gamer or a retro collector, this is one of the most fun consoles to go back to. Like I said, many failed consoles have a very lackluster library. I have a 3DO. I have a Sega CD. As much as I love those systems, the library is very limited. The Sega Saturn has one of the largest libraries of really any game console of that era. It has more games than the Sega Genesis, and look at how much we love going back to the Sega Genesis. So if you love Sega and you want to continue to explore those Sega games all over again, it's time to get a Sega Saturn. Guys, I hope you liked the video. If you liked what you saw, hit that subscribe button, stick around. If you want to support the channel, become a channel member. It's $1.99 a month. You get access to all the retro live streams we do, take game requests, hang out, and it's a good way to support the channel. Until next time, guys, do you even Sega Saturn, bro? I'll see you on the next video.